In this video, we're going to talk about chords and how chords are constructed. Now, a chord means that you have a number of notes stacked on top of each other and played at the same time. The most basic version of a chord is what's called a triad, and that means there are three notes stacked on top of each other in thirds. We're going to be in C major today. So if you look here, we have a C major triad. And the C major triad is built like this. On the bottom, we have our C, or the root note, which is the note upon which the chord is built, or otherwise known as the first scale degree. Stacked on top of that, we have our major third, the third scale degree, which in this case is E. And then finally stacked on top of that is the perfect fifth, our fifth scale degree, which in C major is G. Now this chord is in what's called root position, which means the root, or scale degree number 1, is on the bottom. There are other inversions of these chords, but we're not going to talk about those today. Now the C major chord sounds like this. Now to make the C major chord into a C minor chord, all we need to do is lower the third a half step. So in order for a chord to be minor, that first interval in the triad needs to be a minor third. So we've turned our E natural into E flat, and that sounds like this. Now as you can see, you can certainly build chords with more than just three notes. So we're going to talk about some of the common chords with additional notes. One that's very common in popular and jazz music is the major seventh chord, which means on top of our major chord, our major triad, we've simply added another third and we've stacked that major 7 on top. This is the chord symbol that you would read for major 7 if you were reading off of a chord chart. And here's how it sounds. Now if you were to stack a minor 7th on top of your major scale, this is called a dominant 7th chord. This is a very common chord in jazz music, and it sounds a little bluesy. The chord symbol just has a 7 on top. So this means we assume that it's a major chord, C major, with the minor 7th, or dominant 7th, on top. This is what that sounds like. Now if you were to see something like this, where it says C sus4, that doesn't mean that this chord is suspicious in any way. It means that there's a suspension, okay, and that we're suspending the fourth scale degree, which probably in the next measure would resolve typically to the major third. You can suspend many other notes. This is probably the most common. Sometimes there's a sus6, but here's what the C sus4 sounds like. The next scale that I want to talk about is the augmented scale. The augmented chord. And to augment a chord, you take the perfect fifth and you raise it by a half step. So in this example, we take our G and raise it to G sharp. Now there are two chord symbols you might see. This C plus is one of the common symbols for an augmented chord, for C augmented. You might also see C aug, A-U-G. Both of those mean the same thing, and that's to raise the fifth scale degree. And that sounds like this. The next quality of chord we're going to talk about is diminished. Now, in order to diminish a chord, you have to have a minor chord already, a minor third, on the bottom. So we have C to E flat, and then another minor third stacked on top. So we take that perfect fifth and we lower it by a half step. We get that tritone. So in this case, we go from G to G flat. And here's what that sounds like. You already got a little taste of what the half diminished seventh chord sounds like, but when it comes to diminished sevenths, there are two kinds of diminished sevenths. There is what's called a half diminished seventh and a fully diminished seventh. For the half diminished seventh, we stack our minor third, another minor third, and then we have a major third on top of that. Or if you're relating it to the root, it's the minor seventh from the root on top of a diminished chord. And it sounds like this. Now for a chord to be fully diminished, we need to stack purely minor thirds on top of one another. So C to E flat to G flat, and now technically this should be G flat to B double flat. However, my personal preference when I'm writing these out is to simplify the accidentals to make it easier to read. So in this case I've put A natural. Maybe not strictly correct notationally speaking, but it works for me. When you're looking at your chord symbols, your fully diminished chord is going to have that same little circle that your diminished triad has. Your half diminished seventh is going to have a little slash running through it. Here's what the fully diminished seventh chord sounds like. Occasionally, in some pop or jazz charts, you might see C dim or C dim 7. Typically, though, you'll see these kind of symbols. Now we can start to get into some really crazy chords by adding all kinds of different intervals. In this example, we have what's called a C major 9, which means we've added at the very top a ninth above our root, which is also the second scale degree. Now when you get into these extended chords, it's assumed that if I have a ninth or an 11th or even a 13th, that you add the intervals beneath it. So for instance, when you're looking here at the C major 9, you'll notice there's also the major 7th, even though I didn't notate that in the chord symbol. Likewise, with a major 11th, it's assumed that the major 7 and major 9 are in there as well. This is what the C major 9 sounds like. The last chord I want to talk about in this video is, it doesn't have necessarily a name. This example that I'm showing you is a C add 6. You may see chord symbols that add all kinds of other notes. Typically, those will say add followed by the interval, especially if you're talking about adding a ninth or an 11th without those intervals underneath like we just talked about. So if you see C add 9, C add 11, or sometimes you'll see C flat 6, C flat 5, those are indicative of the intervals above the root. So you could really see anything. And again, typically, if you're not going to add all of those intervals underneath for a 9th, 11th, or 13th, it should say add. In this example here, we have a C6, and this is what that sounds like. So hopefully this video will give you a better understanding of how to interpret chord charts. Again, most often these are indicating intervals above your root note. So it would be helpful to be really comfortable with your scales and with identifying major and minor intervals before really diving into chords.